The phone buzzed against my palm just as I picked up the menu. I had been sitting there for 40 minutes, alone at a table dressed for two, with a candle between us that nobody had lit yet because the evening had not started, or so I thought. The message was short and warm. It was the kind of message a man sends when he wants you to feel like he is thinking of you even when life gets in the way. I'm stuck at work. Happy 31st anniversary, babe. I read it twice. I even touched the screen with my thumb the way you do when something feels tender and you want to hold it a little longer. And then I looked up. 'Cause that is what women do, we look up. We scan the room for danger even when we are trying to feel safe. I looked up without planning to, and my eyes went straight across the restaurant to a table near the far window, the one with a small vase of white flowers and a candle that was already lit. And there he was. My husband of 31 years. Not stuck at work. Not delayed by traffic. Not held back by anything except the hand he was pressing to his lips, which was not mine. I did not blink right away. I sat there with the phone still in my hand and the glow of his message still on the screen, and I let my eyes do the very hard work of confirming what my chest had already known before my mind caught up. He was leaning across that small table with the ease of a man who had been comfortable in that position before. His jacket was folded over the back of his chair. His shoulders were relaxed. The woman across from him was not pulling away. She was not startled. She was not checking over her shoulder the way people do when they feel they are doing something they shouldn't. She was soft and present, and she reached across the table with her other hand and touched his wrist, and he let her. My name is Celestine Ward, and I had arrived early on purpose. When you have been married for 31 years, you learn that arriving early to a celebration is a form of armor. You fix your lipstick before he arrives. You take a breath before the first toast. You arrange your face before anyone can see what the day cost you to prepare. I had come in from a hard week, and I had told myself that tonight was going to be different. That we were going to look at each other across a nice table and remember the version of ourselves that had chosen one another back when choosing felt easy. I had pressed my dress and worn the earrings he gave me on our 25th, and I had driven to that restaurant, believing in the evening. The woman turned her head. Only slightly. Only enough for the candlelight to move across her face in a way that showed me her profile. And that was when the air left me in a way that didn't make a sound. I knew that face. I had stood beside it in a church 4 years ago and watched it light up when my son Marcus slid a ring onto the finger that my husband was now holding. That was Renata, my daughter-in-law, Marcus's wife. The woman who came to Sunday dinners and kissed my cheek at the door and once asked me, teary-eyed on my couch, whether I thought marriage was supposed to be this hard. I had held her hands that evening and told her every marriage takes work. I had believed I was helping. Now I sat across a restaurant from the answer to what had really been making her marriage hard, and the answer had my husband's face. Something very cold moved through me, not like water, more like glass, slow and sharp and quiet. The waiter came back and asked whether I was ready to order, and I looked up at him and said, "Just a few more minutes," and my voice was even. Surprised me. I did not know I still had that kind of steadiness in me at a moment like this one, but the body has its own memory. Mine remembered how to hold still in a storm because I had learned it the hard way before. Walter reached for her hand again and she let him take it, and I sat there watching it happen the way you watch something fall in slow motion, knowing there is nothing left to do but witness it. If you are listening to me right now, I want you to take a breath wherever you are. Because what I am about to tell you did not end in that restaurant. Started there. I put my phone face down on the table because I could not look at his message and look at him at the same time without something in me breaking that I would not be able to put back together. I stood up. My legs were not shaking, but they felt strange, like the ground had changed texture without warning, like I was walking on a surface that looked exactly the same but would not respond the same way it used to. I pushed my chair back and I moved toward them. I did not plan what I was going to say. There are moments in life that are too large for planning. You move toward them because staying still would make you something you don't want to be. I had taken maybe 4 steps when a hand came down gently on my forearm. Not grabbing. Not rough. Just landed there the way a careful person places something. Down when they don't want to make noise. Turned. It was a woman. She was perhaps a few years younger than me, wearing a gray blouse and small pearl earrings, sitting at the table I had just passed. She was alone. She had a half-eaten plate in front of her and a glass of wine she was not drinking. She had the look of someone who had been watching for longer than I had. She leaned forward only slightly and she spoke in a voice so low I had to lean in to catch it. She said, "Please don't go over there yet. Just wait." I stared at her. My mouth opened and then closed again because something about the quiet certainty in her face stopped me from speaking. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't frightened. She looked like a person who already knew how a particular kind of story ends and was trying to spare me the version that would cost me the most. I stayed where I was. She said, "I've seen them here before. Sit back down. The real part hasn't happened yet." My ears went hot. The room around me continued its ordinary business. Glasses clinked. Someone across the restaurant laughed too loudly at a joke. A child at a nearby booth pressed her small hand to the glass and left a smudge. All of it continued as if the floor of my life had not just opened up beneath me. I looked at this stranger and I looked at my husband and I looked back at this stranger again. She gestured very slightly toward my table. She did not make a scene. Neither did I. I walked back. I sat down. My hands were flat on the table and focused on keeping them still. She leaned just far enough across the gap between our tables to speak without raising her voice. "My name is Patricia," she said. "I have been coming to this restaurant for a long time. I saw them here 3 weeks ago. And before that once more." I tried to process that. 3 weeks ago I had been helping Walter choose an anniversary gift for us. He had texted me a photo of 2 necklaces and asked which one I liked more, and I had picked the longer chain. And told him he had good taste. 3 weeks ago, while I was smiling at a photo he sent me, he had been sitting in this same room with Renata. Patricia wrapped both hands around her wine glass and looked at me steadily. I could see that she was deciding how much to say and how fast. She had a careful face, the kind that belongs to a woman who has learned to read situations quickly and speak into them precisely. She said, "There is a man who is going to walk through that door in the next few minutes. And when he does, I think you need to be sitting down and I think you need to be watching." My stomach turned over. "What man?" I asked. She said his name quietly. I did not recognize it. But something about the way she said it made me understand that I was supposed to, that this name existed in the parts of my husband's life that I had not been invited into. I looked at Walter again. He was speaking now, and Renata was listening with her chin slightly lowered, the way she listened when something mattered to her. She had that same posture at my kitchen table when she talked about her marriage to Marcus. The realization hit me so hard I had to look away. Everything she had told me about her unhappiness, every tea-filled evening she had spent on my sofa asking me quiet questions about love and loyalty and whether a person could change, she had been gathering something. I had thought she was confiding in a mother-in-law. She had been managing one. I pressed my hands harder against the tabletop and I breathed slowly and I watched the door. Patricia was right. He came through it 7 minutes later. Counted. I was counting because counting kept me steady. He was a tall man with a blue coat and a face that moved quickly around the room the way faces do when they are looking for something specific. He spotted Walter and Renata's table and he did not slow down or hesitate. He walked straight over like he knew exactly where he was going and pulled out the 3rd chair at their table as if it had been left there for him. Walter looked up and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Adjustment. The careful rearranging of a man who has just realized that 2 parts of his life have arrived in the same room. Renata went very still. The new man sat down. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a folded envelope on the table in front of Walter. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then Walter picked it up. I could not see his face from where I was sitting, but I could see the set of his shoulders change. They dropped slightly, not in relief. In the way Wade arrives. Patricia said softly, "That man is the one who handles the money." I turned to look at her. She said it simply like a fact she had been holding for the right moment. She said, "I overheard things the last time they were here. I know what kind of business your husband has been in that you don't know about. I want you to understand what you are seeing before you walk over there, because if you walk over there without knowing, you will only see the surface of it. And the surface of it will hurt you in a way that is manageable. But the rest of it," she paused, "the rest of it is going to require you to be very careful." My heart was beating in a way I had never felt it beat before. Not fast exactly. Deliberate. Like it was marking time. I looked at my husband sitting across a restaurant with the woman who had eaten at my table and the man who apparently handled money I knew nothing about. I thought about 31 years. I thought about our first apartment with a window that didn't close all the way and how we used to argue about it every winter, and one February I bought a draft stopper and slid it under the frame and he laughed and said I was the most practical woman he had ever loved. I thought about Marcus being born and the way Walter cried in that hospital hallway. Not quiet tears, real ones, the kind that come from somewhere a person doesn't guard. Thought about the morning we buried his mother and he held my hand so hard he left a small mark on my palm that lasted 2 days, and I never said anything because there was nothing to say. 31 years. And then I looked at that table. And I thought, how long has this been a part of those 31 years? How many of those memories were real, and how many were rooms in a house I was never given the full map to? Patricia touched the edge of my hand. Very briefly. Not to comfort. To ground. She said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I don't know yet." And she nodded like that was the right answer. The restaurant kept moving around us. The child pressed another handprint against the glass. The waiter brought someone at the bar a drink they hadn't ordered yet but would clearly need by the end of the evening. And across the room, my husband and the woman who called me Mom at Christmas, and the man with the blue coat and the envelope sat at a table with a lit candle. And talked about whatever it is people talk about when they have decided that the truth belongs to them alone. I sat with a stranger who had decided to hand some of it back. Patricia told me carefully and in a low voice what she had overheard on the earlier evening. It had not been a full conversation, she said. She was not pretending she had heard everything. But she had been placed close enough, and the room had gone quiet enough at a particular moment that certain words had reached her clearly. The word she had heard most clearly was transfer. And the word after that was account. And after that, a name she had looked up afterward because it bothered her and she couldn't leave it alone. The name was a business. It was registered under a holding company. She showed me on her phone. She had written it down in her notes app the night she overheard it, and she had done a small amount of searching, and what she found made her uneasy enough that when she saw the same 2 people walk into this restaurant tonight, she had stayed longer than she meant to. She had been about to leave when I walked in alone. She did not know I was connected until she watched my face when I noticed them. She said, "You had the exact expression of someone who cannot believe their eyes but also cannot look away." I recognized that look. I said, "How do you recognize that look?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I have worn it." I did not ask her to say more. Some things are private even between strangers who are helping each other. In the dark. What she had found in that search was not dramatic in the way that word normally sounds. It was quiet. It was the kind of thing that lives in paperwork and addresses and names that don't match the ones you know. A business Walter had never mentioned. An address that was not ours, not his office, not anywhere I could place on any map of his life that I had been given. A name listed as co-director that I did not recognize but that Patricia said she had seen. On a business registration that listed a second name. Renata's maiden name. My daughter-in-law had a business with my husband that predated her marriage to my son. I sat with that information. I placed it very carefully in my mind the way you place a full glass on an unsteady surface. Slowly, precisely, not because you are calm but because spilling it would make everything worse. I asked Patricia how long ago the business had been registered. She turned her phone toward me again. 4 years ago. Renata had married Marcus 3.5 years ago. So she had been in business with my husband for 6 months before she became my daughter-in-law. Before she stood in a church and cried happy tears. Before she came to Sunday dinners. Before she sat on my sofa and asked me in a tearful voice whether I thought Marcus was the right man for her, and I had taken her hands and told her that love was a choice you made every day and that if she believed in it, it was worth fighting for. I had given her a reason to stay. when what she needed was a reason to leave. Or perhaps she had never needed one at all. Perhaps Marcus had never been the point. I looked at my hands on the table. Patricia was watching me with the careful attention of someone who is ready to catch something if it falls. Nothing fell. I have spent my life learning how to hold things. I asked her, "What do I do with this?" She said, "That is entirely up to you. But I think you should know it before you decide. And I think you should have someone who knows the kind of things that are in that business registration look at it before you make any move at all." She meant a lawyer. She was too careful to say it plainly in a restaurant full of strangers, but she meant a lawyer. And I understood her. I was born into a family that solved its problems at the kitchen table, and I had spent my adult life doing the same. But a kitchen table could not hold what was sitting on the other side of this room. This was going to need a different kind of table. Entirely. I looked at Walter one more time. He was talking again. The man in the blue coat was nodding slowly and making small marks on something I couldn't see. Renata had her hands around a glass and she was looking at the table the way you look at something you are trying not to look at. There was no ease on her face now. There was the careful stillness of a person who is listening to something they did not quite expect. Walter was doing most of the talking. His hands were moving the way they moved when he was explaining something he felt very confident about. I had sat across from those hands for 31 years. I knew what confidence looked like on him. What I had never learned to read until that evening was what it looked like when it was misplaced. I turned back to Patricia. Said, "Thank you." She said, "I'm sorry this is your anniversary." And I said, "So am I." And then I said, "But I would rather know." She said, "Yes, everyone would rather know. But not everyone gets told." We sat there a while longer. I ordered water. She finished her wine. We did not talk much after the main things had been said because there was a kind of silence between us that didn't feel empty. It felt held. Two women at separate tables in the same restaurant choosing the harder thing together. Across the room, Walter placed his hand on the envelope and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. The man in the blue coat stood. He buttoned one button of his coat. He said something brief and left the way he had come, quickly and without looking back. Renata watched him go and then turned back to Walter. They spoke for a few more minutes. Then Walter reached for her hand again. She let him take it. And I sat at my table with Patricia beside me and I thought about all the things I did not yet know and all the things I already did, and I understood that those two piles were about to trade places. The evening ended for them before it ended for me. I watched them stand and gather their things and move toward the door. The way people move when an evening has gone the way they planned it to. Easy. And hurried. Walter paused to button his coat. He did not scan the room. A man with a clean conscience scans the room. A man with a managed secret walks through it like he owns the floor. They left. Waited. Patricia looked at me and said, "You don't have to go home tonight if you don't want to. You can give yourself a few hours." And I said, "No. I want to go home. I want to be inside my own house where I can think clearly." She understood. She wrote her name and her number on the back of a receipt and she slid it across the table to me. She said, "Call me if you need someone to talk to who is not in the middle of it." I folded it and put it in my purse. I sat for another few minutes after she left. The restaurant filled and emptied around me, and the candle on the table the waiter had finally lit sometime during everything flickered in the small draft from the door opening and closing. Put on my coat. I left a tip for the waiter even though I hadn't ordered anything more than water because courtesy costs nothing, and at that moment it was one of the few things I still had full control over. I walked out into the night air and it was cooler than when I had gone in, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up. My husband had kissed another woman on our anniversary. My daughter-in-law had a secret business that predated her marriage to my son. There was an envelope and a man in a blue coat and an address that didn't exist on any map of my life. And I was standing on a sidewalk in the dress I had pressed that morning, believing the evening was going to be different. It was different. I drove home. Walter was already there. His coat was hanging by the door the way it always hung, and the kitchen light was on the way it was always on, and he was sitting in his chair with the television low and a glass of water on the side table, and he looked up when I came in and said, "Hey, you came home without calling. I thought you might wait at the restaurant." I looked at him for a moment. I said I got tired of waiting. He nodded. He said, I'm sorry I couldn't make it, work just wouldn't let up. And I said, I know. And I went upstairs. I changed out of my dress. I hung the earrings he had given me on our 25th back on the hook where they lived. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Not crying. Not planning. Just sitting. Because the night was too large for anything smaller than stillness. And I needed to move through it slowly enough that I didn't lose any piece of what I had just been handed. I was going to need all of it. I slept less than I normally do. Walter came to bed around midnight and said good night, and I said good night, and the word came out of my mouth like a smooth stone, ordinary on the outside and heavy underneath. In the morning he made coffee the way he always made it and set a cup beside my place at the table and sat down with a paper, and I sat across from him and I looked at his face, the face I had woken up to for 31 years, and I thought about everything Patricia had told me. I did not say any of it. Not yet. Because there is a difference between knowing something and being ready to use it, and I was not yet ready and I knew it. Readiness in a situation like this one is not something that arrives on its own. You have to build it. You have to build it quietly, methodically, in the hours when no one is watching before the person across the table understands that. You have begun. I finished my coffee. I washed my cup. I kissed him on the cheek the way I always did before leaving in the morning, and I got in my car and I sat in the driveway for a minute, and then I pulled out my phone and I called my friend Dora. Dora is not a lawyer, but she is the kind of woman who knows exactly who to call when you need one. She has a way of moving through complicated situations the way a river moves through landscape, not around it but through it, finding the path that has always been there even when it wasn't obvious. She picked up on the second ring and I said, I need to talk to you. Not on the phone. She said, I'll be at the cafe on Mercer in 20 minutes. That was Dora. No questions, no performance. Just a location and a time. I drove there. She was already seated when I arrived. She had ordered me a tea without asking because she knew without asking. I sat down across from her and I told her everything. Every piece of it. From the moment the phone buzzed in my hand in that restaurant to the moment I had kissed Walter on the cheek in our kitchen that morning and known something he didn't know I knew. She listened the entire time without interrupting. Dora has the rarest skill in any human being. She knows when listening is the whole job. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, first things first. Before you say a word to Walter or Marcus or anyone else in that family, you need someone to look at that business registration. And you need to understand what is in your name, what is not in your name, and what has been moved. I asked her if she knew someone. She said she did. She said his name was Raymond Osei, and he was a family lawyer who also worked on financial matters, and she trusted him completely. I wrote the name down on a napkin. Dora put her hand over mine for a moment and said, You are handling this the right way. I said I didn't feel like I was handling it at all. She said handling it doesn't mean you feel calm. Means you don't blow it before you know the full shape of it. I called Raymond Osei's office from the parking lot of the cafe. His assistant said he had an opening on Thursday. Took it. Thursday was 3 days away. 3 days of living in my house with my husband, sitting at the same table, sharing the same kitchen, sleeping in the same bed. 3 days of knowing what he did not know I knew. I drove home and I pulled into the driveway and I sat for a moment before going in. Then I went in. Those 3 days were some of the strangest of my life. Not because anything dramatic happened. Because nothing did. Walter came home at normal times. He made jokes at dinner. He asked me how my week was going and I told him about small ordinary things and he nodded and seemed satisfied. He was not performing. That was the part one had to sit with. He was not performing ease. He had ease. Which meant the weight of what he was carrying was not heavy enough to show in his daily behavior. It told me something. It told me he had been carrying it long enough that it no longer felt like weight. It had become familiar. A man who has been living a second life for long enough stops straining under it. He adjusts his posture. He reroutes his guilt into something more manageable. He begins to feel that he has simply become someone with a more complicated arrangement and that this is not exactly the same as doing wrong. I watched him across those 3 days and I thought about the kind of adjustments he must have made without my knowing without my consent, and I kept my face calm and I kept my voice level and I kept the tea warm and the kitchen clean because sometimes the most powerful position is the one the other person never thinks to guard against. Thursday came. I drove to Raymond Osei's office on the other side of the city, a quiet building on a quiet street, the kind of place designed to be unremarkable because the things discussed inside it are not. His assistant showed me in. Raymond Osei was a compact, attentive man with a careful handshake and the kind of stillness that comes from years of hearing difficult things and not flinching. He invited me to sit and he asked me to start from the beginning, and I did. I told him about the restaurant, about Patricia, about the business registration, about Renata's maiden name listed as co-director alongside my husband's, about the envelope and the man in the blue coat and the address that meant nothing to me. I told him all of it in the same order it had happened because the order mattered. He listened and he made notes, and he did not express surprise or sympathy in ways that felt theatrical. When I finished, he asked me a series of questions I had not thought to ask myself. Were my finances joint or separate? I said mostly joint. Had I ever been asked to sign anything in the last several years that pertained to business or property? Thought carefully. He said, take your time. I said, there was a document 2 years ago. He said, describe it. I said, Walter brought home some papers and said they were insurance related, and I signed where he showed me and he put them back in the folder and I never saw them again. Raymond Osei wrote something down slowly. He said, I will need to find out what those papers were. His voice was even. But the way he set down his pen after writing told me something had just become more significant than it was 30 seconds before. He said, I want you to give me access to any financial documents you have at home. Account statements, property papers, anything with both your names on it. He said, don't remove anything from the house. Don't confront your husband. Don't let on that you've been here. Can you do that? Said yes. He said, I'll have my team begin pulling public records on the business registration today. He said it like it was simple, like it was routine. And I understood that for him it was. For me it was the ground cracking open gently and steadily beneath a life I had believed was solid. I left his office with a folder of intake forms and a follow-up appointment, and the particular kind of steadiness that settles over you when you have handed a problem to someone equipped to carry it. The drive home was long and quiet. I did not listen to the radio. I thought instead about Renata, about the version of her I had known or thought I had known, and about the version that had existed all along beneath it. She had been performing for our whole family. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday, every quiet evening on my sofa, she had been holding something back. And the something she was holding back was the most significant thing. I thought about Marcus. My son did not know any of this yet. He was living in the same house as a woman who was in business with his father before she had ever met him, who had come into our family through a door that had already been opened from inside. I thought about how I was going to tell him, and I understood that I was not yet close to that moment. There were too many things I did not know the shape of yet. I needed to know the full shape before I handed it to Marcus, because once I handed it to him there was no taking it back. Pulled into the driveway. I sat for a moment. The lights inside the house were on. Walter's car was in the garage. I went inside. I made dinner. I set the table. We ate together. I asked him how his day was, and he told me about a meeting that had run long. He described it with the kind of specific detail people use when they want something to feel real. I listened and nodded and passed him the salt and did not let anything cross my face that was not supposed to be there. And that night when the lights were out I lay in the dark and I counted the things I knew and the things I needed to know, and I thought about patience not as a feeling but as a structure. A frame you build around yourself when you cannot afford to collapse. Raymond Osei's team moved quickly once they began. Within the first week they had pulled the business registration in full. The company was listed under a name that sounded neutral and forgettable, the kind of name designed to disappear into the background of an internet search. But the documents behind it were not forgettable. Walter was listed as primary director. Renata's maiden name was listed as co-director with full signing authority. The business had been active for 4 years. It had a registered office address that was not our home and not Walter's place of work, but a small commercial suite on the east side of the city. Raymond said that did not necessarily mean the office was being used regularly. What it meant was that the address existed, that someone had chosen it and paid for it, and that it was part of a structure that had been deliberately built. He said, "The question I am now trying to answer is what has moved through this business." He said it like it was a simple next step. But I heard the weight of it. What has moved through this business meant what has moved out of my life through it. The document I had signed 2 years ago turned out to be a property transfer authorization. Not insurance. Property. Walter had shown me a folder, explained it as annual policy renewal, pointed to the signature line. And I had signed because I had trusted him and because 31 years of trust had made me careless with the details. What I had signed had authorized the transfer of a property we owned jointly, a small rental house we had inherited from his uncle, into the holding structure beneath the business. Raymond told me this sitting across from me at his desk with the document on the table between us. He spoke calmly. He always spoke calmly. But he turned the page slowly and said, "I want you to see this before I say anything else, so that what I say lands in the right place." The property had been transferred. It was no longer jointly held. It now sat under the company where Renata had full signing authority alongside my husband. Raymond said that means she has legal access to any decision made about that property. And because the transfer occurred under your signature, however it was obtained, it is currently legal. He said the word currently carefully, like a door held slightly open. I looked at the paper. I had signed my name and lost a piece of my life and not known it for 2 years. I said, "What can be done?" Raymond leaned back slightly and folded his hands. He said, "That depends on what else we find and how you want to proceed." He said there were options. He did not rush through them. He went carefully. One by one, the way you lay out tools before beginning work will take time. Quiet legal discovery. Financial disclosure request if we moved toward formal proceedings. A direct challenge to the property transfer on the grounds of misrepresentation, which he said he believed was documentable. He said, "You have a case. But I want you to understand what a case means. Means time. Means patience. It means you cannot move before you are fully ready because once you move you cannot take it back." He looked me steadily. He said, "Are you ready for that?" And I said, "I came here for the truth. I am ready for whatever it takes." And I meant it. Because sitting in that restaurant with my phone glowing in my hand, and my husband's message on the screen, and my husband's hands on another woman's at a table across the room, had already changed me in a way that could not be undone. The only direction left was forward, and I intended to take it deliberately, one document at a time. Raymond began a formal discovery process with my authorization. He filed for financial disclosure across all jointly held accounts and assets. He put in requests for documentation that Walter's legal team would be required to respond to. He said, "Once this is filed, the timeline changes. Your husband will know that legal processes have started. What he will not know immediately is the full scope of what we have already found." He said, "We have a period between his knowing something has started and his understanding exactly what we know. That period is important. Use it well." I asked him what using it well meant. He said, "It means saying nothing more than necessary. It means letting him think this is about the marriage and not yet about the business. Because if he understands the business is the center of it, he will begin to protect it. And anything he moves to protect becomes harder to get to." I drove home understanding something I had not fully understood before. That the most dangerous thing I could do was show my hand too early. My mother used to say that. She used to say, "Never throw your last card before you know the count of the room." I had not thought about that expression in years. It came back to me on that drive with such precision it felt like she had leaned forward from wherever she was and said it directly into my ear. Kept the house the same. Kept the routines the same. I kept my voice the same and my face the same and my behavior so identical to what Walter expected that he had no surface to catch on. He did not know. Days passed and he did not know, and I gave him nothing to help him figure it out. And in that time Raymond's team kept working. Marcus came for dinner on a Saturday. He came alone. He said Renata was at a friend's thing and would be back late. He sat at the kitchen table where he had always sat and he ate the way he had always eaten, quickly at first and then slower once the first hunger passed, and he talked about a project at work and a weekend trip he was thinking about planning. I listened to him talk and I looked at his face and I thought, this man does not know. He does not know that the woman who is at a friend's thing tonight has a business with his father that is 4 years old, and that his father has been meeting with her in a restaurant on the other side of the city. And he does not know that his mother is sitting across from him right now, calm and present, while inside her chest there is an entire room full of things she cannot yet say. But she is saying them for him. All of it, every careful step, every document, every quiet conversation with Raymond. Every day she got up and made coffee and kissed his father on the cheek and didn't let anything show. All of it was for him too. For Marcus. So that when the moment came and she handed him the truth, it would be a complete truth with a structure around it strong enough to hold him through whatever came next. He stayed for 3 hours. When he left, he hugged me in the doorway, and I held on slightly longer than usual, and he noticed and said, "You okay, Mom?" I said, "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just love seeing you." He smiled and walked to his car. I closed the door and stood in the hallway with my hand still on the frame. 3 weeks after I first sat in Raymond Osei's office, he called me and said, "I think you should come in." He said it in the tone of a man who has something to show rather than just something to say. I went in the next morning. His desk had more papers on it than the last time. He organized them carefully before I sat down. Then he walked me through what his team had found in the disclosure documents Walter's legal side had returned. There were accounts I had not known existed. Not hidden in the theatrical sense of buried or secret. Hidden in the bureaucratic sense of registered under the business, accessible without joint signature, funded through transfers that had been categorized in our shared accounts as miscellaneous expenses or vendor payments. Small enough not to alarm. Large enough over time to matter. Raymond laid them out in order of date and I followed along, and I understood with each page that I was not looking at a man who had made mistakes. I was looking at a man who had built a system. Careful, patient, long-running system. The kind that takes more than a bad decision to create. Takes intention. Takes repetition. It takes the deliberate choice, made again and again over years, to take something and put it somewhere the other person cannot see. He had not stopped loving me in a moment and strayed. He had made a decision at some point before any of this was visible, and had moved steadily in that direction while standing in our kitchen and sharing our bed and sitting at our table with our son. And he had done it alongside a woman who had then married that son. I sat in Raymond's office and I was quiet for a long time. He let me be quiet. Then I said, "What are our next steps?" He nodded. He had the answer already prepared. He told me that based on the misrepresentation involved in the property transfer signature and the financial discovery we now had on record, we could file for full legal separation with a financial disclosure injunction that would freeze asset movement during proceedings. He said that means nothing else can move once we file. Any transfer he attempts after that point becomes a legal matter with direct consequences. He said, "We are ready when you are." I looked at the papers spread across his desk. I thought about the moment in that restaurant. The phone glowing. Text. "Happy 31st anniversary, babe." I thought about how tender it had felt before I looked up. Said, "File it." He said, "I'll begin today." I drove home through streets I had driven for years, past the bakery where I used to take Marcus on Saturday mornings when he was small, past the park where Walter and I had walked so many evenings that I had lost count of them, through the neighborhood where our life had taken the shape it had taken, and I thought about all of the things that shape had been built on, that I had not been allowed to see. I did not feel angry on that drive. I felt something cleaner than anger. I felt decided. Walter was home when I arrived. He was in the kitchen. He had made tea without asking and set a cup for me on the counter the way he always did, like I was about to walk through the door, like he had timed it right, like he still knew me that well. I looked at the cup and I looked at him and I said, "I need you to know that I spoke to a lawyer this week." He turned around. His face arranged itself into surprise, then concern, then something that was not quite either. He said, "About what?" Said, "About us." He said, "Celestine, whatever is going on, whatever you've been thinking, we can talk about it." I said, "I know we can. But I also needed to talk to someone who wasn't inside of it." He put his cup down. He said, "Has something happened?" And I looked at him and I thought about how many times I had watched his face and believed it completely. How many times that face had been the most familiar thing in the room, and I had let that familiarity substitute for truth. Said yes, something happened. I have known about it for a little while. I am not ready to discuss the details yet. But I wanted you to know that I am not in the dark anymore. The room was very quiet. His hands were still on the counter. I watched his face move through something I could not fully name but recognized. The faintest rearrangement of a person whose plan has just been complicated by something they did not anticipate. He said, "I don't know what you think you've found." And I said, "I know what I've found." There's a difference between those two sentences and I think you can hear it. He was quiet. I took my tea and I went upstairs. I sat in the room I used as a reading space, the one with the window seat and the shelves Walter had built for me the year we moved in. I sat and I drank my tea and I let the house be quiet around me. He did not come upstairs for a long time. When he finally did, it was late, and he said my name softly outside the door and I said, "Not tonight, Walter." And he said okay. And I heard him go to the other room. That night was the last night we shared the same floor of the house. He did not leave immediately. People who are trying to manage a situation do not leave until they understand what they are managing. He spent several days being careful and slightly quieter than usual and more attentive in small ways. Cups of tea, holding the door, asking about my day with slightly more focus than was ordinary for him. I accepted the gestures without reading anything into them. I had learned a long time ago that attention and care are not the same thing. A person can be very attentive to something they are trying to control. I continued meeting with Raymond. Walter's legal team had begun responding, and the responses were in the language of people who are measuring their exposure. Raymond said that was expected. He said, when someone realizes the full scope is known, they begin to count the cost. And the first thing they do when counting is try to understand whether cooperation is cheaper than resistance. He said, we will know more about which direction he is going by what comes back in the next filing. Came back in 10 days. Walter's team had filed a response that was cooperative in tone but narrow in scope. They had acknowledged the marriage. They had not yet acknowledged the business. Raymond said that is a choice. And a choice tells us something. He said they are hoping we will separate the two issues. That we will deal with the marriage and leave the business alone. He said we are not going to do that. He said it with the calm certainty of a man who has navigated this particular variety of legal maneuvering before. He said, the business and the marriage are connected by the property transfer alone. That connection is our thread. We pull it and everything attached to it has to come into the light. Said pull it. He said already pulling. The next 2 weeks were a kind of waiting I had not experienced before. Not the anxious kind where you check your phone and jump at sounds. The deliberate kind, where you go about your days knowing that something is in motion that cannot be reversed, and so you stop trying to rush it and simply move carefully alongside it. I cooked. I read. Called Dora twice. I spoke to Raymond once a week. I went to Sunday service and sat in my usual pew and sang the hymns I had always sung and shook hands at the door with people I had known for years, and nobody could see anything on my face that wasn't supposed to be there. That was not dishonesty. That was management. There is a version of keeping quiet that is cowardice and a version that is strategy, and the difference is whether you are doing it to avoid something or to protect something. I was protecting something. I was protecting the outcome. And that outcome required me to still be standing clearly and cleanly when it arrived. Patricia called me. She had saved my number the night we met, and she reached out on a Tuesday morning to say she had been thinking about me. Told her. Things were moving. She said good. She asked if she could do anything, and I said, you already did the most important thing. She said, you did the most important thing. You stayed seated when everything in you wanted to walk across that room. We talked for about 20 minutes. 2 women who had been strangers on the most significant evening of my recent life. I told her I didn't know how to thank her, and she said, you don't have to. Some things people do not because they expect return but because the alternative is being someone who looked away. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Marcus came by again the following weekend. This time Renata came with him. She walked through my door with her usual composure, her coat, her smile, the kiss on my cheek that had always felt like affection and that I now understood was performance. She helped carry in the dish they had brought. She sat at my table. She asked me about my week. Answered. I passed her the bread. I looked at her face and I thought about the version of her that had been in that restaurant. The careful stillness. The hands around the glass. The way she had gone quiet when the envelope arrived. And I thought about the 4-year-old business. The property. The signing authority. The address on the east side of the city that belonged to a structure built on the ruins of what should have been my future. And I passed her the bread and I smiled and I said, I'm glad you could make it. Because the moment for confrontation had not come yet. And when it came, it was not going to come over Sunday dinner with dishes to wash and Marcus sitting between us. It was going to come in the right room with the right documents and the right structure in place. I had learned from Raymond that patience in a legal situation is not the same as waiting. It is active. It is the work of choosing your moment and refusing to act before it arrives, even when everything in you is straining forward. The thing about being the only one who knows the count of the room is that you have to resist the urge to say so. When the room knows you're counting, it starts hiding things. So I held what I knew in both hands and I moved through my days quietly, and I let the process do what I had started it to do. 5 weeks after I first walked into Raymond Osei's office, he called me with a date. He had arranged what he called a full disclosure meeting, which meant Walter and his legal counsel and my legal counsel, meaning Raymond, in a room together with a complete record of what Discovery had produced. He said, I want you present. He said, you don't have to speak. But I think your presence matters. He said, it is one thing for a man to hear about documents in an abstract legal conversation. It is another to have to look at the person those documents concern. I said I would be there. The night before the meeting I sat in my reading room and I went through the summary Raymond had prepared for me. It was thorough. It was quiet. It did not use dramatic language. Legal documents rarely do. But the clarity of them was its own kind of weight. The property transfer. The accounts. The business registration. The timeline showing that the relationship between Walter and Renata in a business capacity had begun before Marcus ever brought her home to meet us. The dates were what undid the story he had never directly told but had allowed to exist by absence. You don't have to lie with words. You can lie with silence and proximity and the slow management of what someone is allowed to see. He had managed me for years. He had been so careful that I had called it trust. I closed the folder and I looked out the window. The street was quiet. A neighbor walked a dog. Someone's porch light came on. The world outside was just doing what it always did, unaware that inside this window a woman was sitting in a reading chair her husband had built for her and making peace, not with what he had done, but with the fact that she had survived it and was still sitting in the chair and still had the documents and still had tomorrow morning and the meeting and every day beyond it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. I wore my gray coat the next morning. The one with the good buttons and the straight hem. I have always believed that the way you dress for a hard day is a kind of signal to yourself about who is going to show up. I wanted someone to show up who was steady, who had already done her grieving in private and arrived to this room ready for the part that came after grief. Raymond met me outside the building and we went in. Together. Walter was already in the conference room when we arrived. He was sitting next to a man in a dark suit who I understood was his attorney. He looked up when I walked in. His face did something when he saw me that I couldn't name precisely, but I recognized it. It was the expression of a man who still believed, even at this late moment, that something could be smoothed over if the right words were used. I sat down. I folded my hands on the table. Raymond opened his folder. And then something happened that was not on any plan. The door opened again. And Renata walked in. She came in with her own attorney, a woman I had never seen. She sat down across from me and she did not look at me for a long moment. When she did, there was something in her face that was not defiance and was not shame but was something more complicated than either. I understood then that she had been told this meeting was happening and she had chosen to attend. To either protect herself or to manage the shape of whatever came next. Raymond looked at her attorney. Her attorney looked at Raymond. Something passed between them in the professional shorthand of people who know the rules of these rooms. Raymond said, "We can accommodate an expanded meeting." Walter looked at her. It was a fast look, contained, but I caught it. There was something in it that was not purely legal strategy. It was the look of a person who is no longer certain which direction safety is coming from. Raymond began. He was methodical. He did not editorialize. He went document by document, timeline by timeline, building the picture the way a careful person builds something meant to hold weight. He walked through the business registration. He walked through the accounts. He walked through the property transfer. And at that point he paused and placed the document I had signed 2 years ago on the table, my signature visible, and he let the room look at it. He said, "This document was signed by my client under the representation that it was an insurance renewal. That representation is demonstrably false." He said it simply. He let the simplicity do the work. Renata's attorney made a note. Walter's attorney cleared his throat. Walter looked at the paper with my name on it, and he looked at me, and for the first time in the weeks since the restaurant I saw something real cross his face. Not guilt exactly. Recognition. The recognition of a man who is realizing that the gap between what he believed I would figure out and what I had actually figured out is wider than he planned for. Raymond continued. When everything was on the table, he sat back and said, "My client is prepared to proceed toward full legal dissolution with asset disclosure injunction in place, and a direct challenge to the property transfer on grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation." He looked at Walter's attorney. He said, "How does your client wish to respond?" The room was quiet. I did not look at Walter. I looked at my hands. And then Walter said, quietly, "I would like to speak directly." His attorney put a hand on his arm. He said no thank you to the hand, and he looked at me and he said, "Celestine." One word. My name in his voice, the voice I had known for 31 years, the voice that had whispered good night and laughed at the kitchen table and called me from the hospital the night his mother died. I looked at him. He said, "I am sorry." I did not answer. Because sorry is a word that belongs to mistakes, and what I was looking at was not a mistake. It was a structure. It had beams and walls and documents with my signature on them. It had a business registration and an address and an account and a timeline that went back 4 years before I had ever seen it from the restaurant. Sorry belongs to moments. This had been built over years. I turned to Raymond and I said, "Please continue." He nodded. He continued. Renata sat very still through the rest of it. Her attorney spoke twice. Once to clarify a timeline and once to request postponement of 30 days for response. Raymond granted 20. Walter's team made no further statements in the room. At the end, Raymond gathered his documents and we stood and we walked out, and I did not look back at the table because I had looked at it long enough. In the corridor, Raymond said, "That went about the way I expected." He said, "The request for postponement is a classic response to a complete record. They need time to figure out what they can and cannot counter." He said, "We are in a strong position," said and Marcus. He said, "That depends on what Renata's team does with the 20 days. He said, "I would begin thinking about how you want to handle your son's situation because it is likely to become more visible in the next few weeks." I drove home and I called Dora from the car. She already knew the meeting was today. She picked up before it rang twice. I said, "It went well." She said, "Of course it did." She said, "I've known you for 23 years and I have never seen you begin something you weren't going to finish." I sat with the car in the driveway for a few minutes after we hung up. The afternoon was quiet around me. Then I went inside and I made dinner for one for the first time in 31 years. It was a smaller portion than I was used to making. But it was mine entirely. I told Marcus on a Sunday. I chose Sunday because Sundays had always been the day in our family when hard things were said out loud, because that was the day we sat still long enough to hold them. I had planned it carefully. I had chosen words that were honest and direct and did not use cruelty to carry the truth. Because Marcus had done nothing wrong and the truth did not require decoration. He deserved to receive it cleanly. I sat him down at the kitchen table. I put tea in front of him. I told him from the beginning. The restaurant. Text. Patricia. What I had seen. What I had discovered with Raymond's help. The business registration. His wife's name on it. Timeline. He listened without interrupting. His face moved through things I watched carefully. Disbelief first. Then a particular kind of stillness. Then something deeper and slower that I understood was the moment the pieces were fitting together in a way that made patterns he had noticed before and ignored or dismissed suddenly make sense. When I stopped speaking, the kitchen was very quiet. He looked down at his tea. He didn't drink it. He just looked at it. Then he said, "How long have you known?" Said, "Several weeks." He said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said, "Because I needed the full picture before I handed it to you. Because you deserved the full picture and not just the part that would have sent you straight to Renata before we had anything solid under us." He was quiet again. Then he said, "The business. For years. Before we even met." Said, "Yes." He pressed both hands flat on the table. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them and he said, I said, "I know, sweetheart." No. He didn't cry at the table. He cried later, in the hallway when he was putting his coat on to leave. He thought I couldn't hear him, but I could. I stood in the kitchen doorway and I let him have it because sometimes love means giving a person the privacy of their own grief, even when you are 3 feet away. He hugged me at the door for a long time. He said, "You should not have had to carry this alone." I said, "I wasn't alone for all of it. I had the right people." He nodded. He went home. Not to his and Renata's home. To a hotel, I found out later. Because he needed to be somewhere that was just his own for a night. Thought that was wise. I thought that was a man who understood something about himself, that he could not walk back into that apartment and be okay. And who, instead of forcing it, gave himself the space to not be okay in a neutral room with a closed door. The following weeks were not easy for any of us. Easy is not what truth produces most of the Truth produces clarity. And clarity is harder to live inside than the comfortable fog of not knowing. Marcus had conversations with Renata that I was not part of and am not going to speak about here because they belong to him. What I can say is that he handled them with a steadiness that I recognized and was proud of even in the middle of everything else. He did not perform his anger. He did not disappear into it. He moved through it the way you move through weather. Head down. Forward. Trusting that the other side of it exists. Renata's attorney submitted a response within the 20 days. It was narrower than I expected, which Raymond said meant that on their legal advice she was stepping back from the business and allowing it to be handled through the larger proceedings. He said, "That tells me she has been advised that the connection to the marriage makes the business a liability for her. It is a smart move. It is also an admission by omission." He said, "In these situations what people stop defending tells you as much as what they claim." I did not gloat when he said that. There was nothing to gloat about. A person had been in my home and at my table and in my family and had been a part of something that had hollowed out a corner of my life without my knowledge. That was not a victory. That was a loss that came with documentation. Walter, to his credit or his legal team's, had stopped trying to soften things through personal conversation and had moved entirely into the formal process. Every exchange went through counsel. Every question was answered in documents. The man who had sat across from me at breakfast for 31 years and asked me how I slept and whether I wanted more coffee now communicated with me exclusively through the language of legal response and formal request. And I understood that this was the right way. Because the personal version of him was too practiced. He knew how to use familiarity. He knew how to use my history with his face and his voice and his hands around a mug of coffee in our kitchen. The formal process removed those tools. In their absence, what was left was only what the documents said. And the documents said enough. The financial disclosure injunction held through the proceedings. Nothing moved that was not supposed to move. The accounts Raymond had identified were frozen pending legal review. The property transfer challenge was filed formally with supporting documentation, and the misrepresentation claim was in place. There would still be time before resolution. These things do not close quickly. But the frame was solid, and solid frames do not require urgency. They require maintenance and patience, and the consistent willingness to stay present in the process rather than looking ahead to an end that will arrive on its own schedule. I did not move out of the house immediately. I stayed because the house was mine as much as it was anyone's, and because leaving is not always the power move people think it is. Leaving can mean yielding. Staying, when you stay on your own terms with your own lawyer and your own structure in place, is something else. Walter left eventually. Not all at once. Gradually, the way water finds its level. First, more nights spent elsewhere. Then the absence of his coat on the hook by the door. Then the quietness of the house that had a different quality than ordinary quiet. The quiet of a space that has decided what it is without the noise of what it was pretending to be. Dora came over on the evening after the last of his things had been collected. We sat in the kitchen with the good dishes and the real tea, and we talked about small things for a while before either of us named the large one. Then she said, "How are you?" And I said, "Clearer than I have been in years." And I meant it not as a brag but as a true description of a state I had not known I was missing until I got it back. She said, "Good." Then she poured more tea and we talked about other things. Because a woman's life is not just the betrayal she survived. It is also the tea she drank after it. And the friend across from her, and the good dishes she chose to use because the evening deserved them. Raymond called me a month later to say that the property transfer challenge had been accepted for formal review. He said it with the same measured calm he brought to every communication. But he said, "I want you to hear this as the significant thing it is." He said, "We made a claim based on documented misrepresentation, and that claim is now inside the legal process where it belongs." He said, "I told you from the beginning that you had a case." He said, "A case doesn't mean instant resolution. It means the record exists and the record will be heard. And that is more than a lot of people get." Said, I know that." And he said, "How are you, Mrs. Ward?" And I said, "Moving forward, Mr. Osei. 1 foot at a time." He said, "That is the only speed that holds." Marcus moved through his own process. He filed for divorce. He did it quietly and without involving the wider family in the drama of it. He told his cousins what they needed to know and no more. He told his friends even less. He is a private person and a dignified one, and he handled the most undignified situation he had ever been placed in with the kind of grace that comes from being raised to understand that your behavior in hard moments is more defining than your behavior in easy ones. I did not tell him how proud I was often enough during that time. I said it once and clearly, and I hope it landed the way I meant it to, which was fully and without condition. He said I had a good teacher. And I did not know what to say to that, so I hugged him instead. Renata moved out of their apartment within the month. She did not contest the divorce in any way that created extended process. I think by then she understood that every document produced in those proceedings was going to show something she did not want to stand beside in a formal record. That understanding, when it arrives, tends to move people efficiently. She left the city not long after. I don't know where she went. It is not mine to know. I was asked by someone at my church whether I felt sorry for her, and I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said, I feel sorry for the years she spent building something on a foundation that was never going to hold her. I don't feel sorry for the choices she made inside those years. There is a difference between pitying someone's situation and excusing their behavior, and I have never found a reason to confuse the two. The legal proceedings continued into the following months. There were filings and responses and review periods, and the particular silence of waiting for systems to move at their own pace, which they do regardless of how urgent the matter feels from the inside. Raymond kept me informed without overwhelming me. He had a gift for knowing exactly how much information was useful and when more than that crossed into noise. I paid attention to what he said and I trusted the structure and I let it work. Walter's board role at the civic committee he had served on for 12 years was not renewed that year. No public statement. No drama. Just a letter thanking him for his service and noting that the board was moving in a new direction. He had been anticipating that renewal. He had mentioned it to me twice in the year before everything. Now it simply did not happen. A mentorship program he had been a visible part of quietly transferred its coordination to someone else. Again, no announcement. Just a name change on the letterhead that spoke for itself. This is how professional standing actually diminishes. Not in scenes. In administrative decisions made by people who have been watching and have updated their assessment. The money settled over time. That is the truest way to describe it. Settled. Like sediment finding the bottom of a disturbed body of water. What was mine was restored where it could be restored. What had been moved could not all be retrieved, but enough of the record had been established that the movement itself was documented and that documentation had weight. The property challenge resulted in a return of my full joint share. Raymond called me when it was finalized and said, "I know this is not everything, but it is what the law can do cleanly, and I want you to hear it said plainly. Your claim was valid. The challenge was successful. That is not nothing." I said, "I know what it is. It is mine." He said, "Exactly." The day the divorce was finalized, I sat in Raymond's office for the last time in that formal capacity. He had a small file for me to sign. Practical and unremarkable on the outside. Enormous on the inside. In the way that final things always are. I signed it. Raymond shook my hand and said, "Mrs. Ward, it has been a genuine privilege." Thanked him. I meant it without reservation. He had been the most important stranger in my life after Patricia, and neither of them had been required to be what they were to me, and both of them had been anyway. That matters. It matters more than I know how to put into words precisely, but I have tried, because the women who might one day sit in a restaurant with a glowing phone in their hands and look up at something they cannot immediately believe, they need to know that strangers can save you. Not the romantic kind of saving. The practical kind. The kind that says, "Stay seated, I know something you don't know yet. Let me help you know the full shape of it before you move." That is the kind of saving that changes the outcome. I walked out of Raymond's office into a clear afternoon. Not dramatic. Not rainy. Not sunset-lit and significant looking. Just a Tuesday in a month that was going about its business. A woman walked past me talking on her phone, and a delivery person wrestled a cart up the curb, and a pigeon on the railing looked at me briefly and decided I was not interesting. And I stood there in the middle of all of it, and I breathed in the afternoon air, and I thought, here I am. Here I still am. That was enough. Marcus called me that evening. He knew it was the day. He said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Like myself." He said, "That sounds right." We talked for a while about ordinary things. His work. A book he was reading. A walk he had taken that weekend through the part of the city he had not explored before, because when you are healing you need new streets. You need geography that has no memory of the thing you are trying to move through. He was healing. I could hear it in the way he talked about small things with something close to curiosity. Curiosity is one of the first things that comes back after grief. It is a sign that you have decided. The world is still worth exploring. That phone call was one of the best I have ever had with my son. Not because of what was said. Because of what was underneath it. Two people who had been through the same hard thing arriving on the same evening at the same quiet place. Still standing. Still moving. Still each other's. The weeks and months that followed were mine in a way time had not been mine for a long time. I made decisions without consulting anyone's comfort except my own. I rearranged the furniture in the reading room because I had always wanted it differently and had never said so. I bought a plant I had been thinking about for years and put it in the kitchen window where the morning light lands. I called Patricia and we met for lunch and talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with that evening and about things that had everything to do with it, and both kinds of conversation felt equally right. She had moved through her own version of a hard time in a year before we met, and she did not make it sound simpler than it had been or harder either. She just told it plainly the way plain people tell plain truths. And I sat across from her at that lunch table and I thought about the word stranger and how insufficient it was for the category she actually occupied in my life. She had been in the right place at the right time, and she had chosen to act on what she saw instead of looking away. That is not a stranger. That is something the language hasn't quite named yet. I am still inside this life. I want you to know that. I am not writing to you from the other side of it because there is no other side. There is only further inside it, further along it, more familiar with its terrain. I am further along. I still have days that are harder than others. Days when a song comes on the radio or a smell drifts through the kitchen or I pass a restaurant with low amber lighting and something in me goes very still for a moment before moving on. I let those moments be what they are. I don't argue with them or apologize for them. I let them arrive and I let them pass and I keep moving. Because that is the thing about forward. It does not require you to have fully left the past behind. It only requires you to keep your feet pointed in the right direction. The truth about what happened is this. Walter did not stumble into a situation. He chose one. He built one. He maintained it across years and documents and dinners and conversations and a great deal of carefully managed silence. And Renata did not fall in love and lose her way. She made decisions before she ever sat at my Sunday table that connected her to my family through a route she had helped design. Neither of them acted out of weakness. They acted out of intention. Cannot change that. I cannot undo the years or restore the particular innocence of believing fully in the life I thought I was living. What I can do and what I did is refuse to let the shape of what they built determine the shape of what I build next. My house is mine now in every sense. My days have the rhythm I give them. My kitchen smells like whatever I choose to cook. My reading room has the furniture in the arrangement I prefer. The plant in the window grows toward the morning light the way plants do when they are in the right place. And I sit with my tea in the evenings and I think about the restaurant, about the text, about the phone glowing in my hand and the word babe and 31 years and what all of it really held beneath the surface. And I think about Patricia at the next table making a choice that cost her nothing but changed everything. And I think about Raymond Osei who heard a hard story and built a solid structure out of it and handed it back to me in the form of a finalized document with my name restored to the things that were mine. And I think about Marcus on that Tuesday evening talking about new streets and curiosity and the way grief loosens when you let it move. And I think about Dora and the good tea and the good dishes and the ordinary miracle of a friend who shows up without you having to explain why you need her. And I think about myself in that restaurant in the dress I had pressed and the earrings from our 25th and the glass of water sweating on the linen. I think about the moment I put the phone face down on the table. Not because I couldn't look at it. Because I had already seen everything I needed to see. And I had decided without knowing yet that I had decided. To see it all the way through to the end. That woman in the restaurant was brave. I want to say that because I was her and I know how much it cost her to stay seated and breathe and wait and not explode into the middle of that room and take everything down with her, including herself. She was brave in the specific way that is invisible, the way that looks from the outside like a woman sitting quietly at a table for two while a candle burns and a waiter asks if she needs a few more minutes. That bravery did not make noise, but it built everything that came after. If you are sitting with something right now that feels too large to hold, I want you to hear this from someone who has held something very large. You do not have to hold it perfectly. You do not have to hold it without shaking. You only have to hold it long enough to find the people and the structures that can help carry it with you. They exist. Patricia existed. Raymond existed. Dora existed. Marcus, even in his own pain, existed. The right people show up when you let yourself be ready to receive them. Not before. Not on your schedule. But they show up. I'm going to tell you one last thing and then I'm going to let you go and sit with all of this for as long as you need to. Walter thought that what he was building was a future. He thought the accounts and the business and the property and the careful years of managed silence were the bricks of something he was constructing toward. He thought the other life, the one with a lit candle and the address I had never been given and the woman who had sat at my table and called me Mom, was a future he was moving toward while the one with me was the past he was gently leaving. What he did not understand is that he was not building a future at all. He was building a record. Every transfer, every document, every date, every signature obtained under false pretense, every meeting in a restaurant with a candle already lit, every choice he made inside those years was a line in a record that I would one day hold in my hands in a lawyer's office on a quiet street in a building designed to be unremarkable. He built a record, and I read it, and I used it, and then I moved on from it. That is the truth they tell you no one can reach. The truth that exists in paper and dates and names and patterns that don't change just because no one has looked at them yet. The truth that waits. I did not destroy him. I did not need to. I simply stopped being the person who absorbed the cost of what he had built. And once I stopped absorbing it, the structure had to find another foundation. Didn't. Structures built on deception never do. They hold for exactly as long as the person being deceived agrees, however unknowingly, to stand beneath them. The moment I moved, the weight fell where it belonged. Not onto Marcus. Not onto me. Onto the people who had placed it. That is how accountability actually works. Not in the loud version where everything breaks at once and everyone can see. In the quiet version where paper trails become formal records, and formal records become legal proceedings, and legal proceedings become outcomes, and outcomes become the rest of your life. I am living the rest of my life now. It is quieter than the one before it. It is also truer. And I have learned in the time since that restaurant that quiet and true are not lesser things. They are often the most lasting ones. 'Cause noise, faith, performance exhausts itself. But truth sits down in the record and stays there, and it does not care how charming you are or how practiced your calm is or how many years you spent managing the version of yourself that the other person was allowed to see. Truth does not need your permission. It only needs someone willing to look. And on our 31st anniversary I looked. And then I made sure the right people looked with me. This is Granny's voice. And if this story sat with you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. We read every one. And remember, the truth you're carrying right now does not have to be carried alone.